After these things, Jesus went over the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias. Then a great multitude followed him, because they saw his signs which he performed on those who were diseased. And Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat with his disciples. Now the Passover, a feast of the Jews, was near. Then Jesus lifted up his eyes, and seeing a great multitude coming toward him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread, that these may eat?" But this he said to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. Philip answered him, 200 denarii worth of bread is not sufficient for them, that every one of them may have a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There is a lad here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish. But what are they among so many?" Then Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." Now there was much grass in the place, so the men sat down, in number about 5,000. And Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to the disciples, and the disciples to those sitting down, and likewise of the fish, as much as they wanted. So, when they were filled, he said to his disciples, "Gather up the fragments that remain, so that nothing is lost." Therefore they gathered them up, and filled 12 baskets with the fragments of the 5 barley loaves, which were left over by those who had eaten. Then those men, when they had seen the sign that Jesus did, said, "This is truly the prophet who is to come into the world." My name's Arthur, and I thank you for joining me as we share together from John chapter 6, verses 1 to 14. So in chapter 5, we were probably 18 months before the crucifixion, if it was the Feast of Tabernacles. The next major feast after the Feast of Tabernacles is the Passover, and we're told that this event occurred just before the Passover, which was the Passover 12 months before Jesus was crucified. Jesus spent most of his time in Galilee because things were not so intense in terms of opposition from the priests and Pharisees in Galilee as they were in Judea. But the intensity of opposition was increasing. Jesus had been busy healing people and teaching people, but particularly teaching his disciples. And we learn from the other Gospels that he had sent his disciples out 2 by 2 to go into all the places that he himself would come to prepare the way. And they had been given authority over evil spirits and to heal, and they came back rejoicing. But they also came back rather exhausted. And so Jesus sought to take some time out with his disciples and go to a quiet place. But it was not to be so. When he came back to Capernaum and the people saw him there, setting out in a boat with his disciples across the bay, they guessed where he was going and went around the coast to this deserted place. John notes that the Sea of Galilee is also known as the Sea of Tiberias. Tiberius Claudius Caesar Augustus was the second emperor of Rome, taking over from his stepfather Augustus Caesar. Jesus began his public ministry, according to Luke, in the 15th year of Tiberius. Tiberius reigned for 23 years and was consolidating the Roman Empire. John mentions this because he's writing to a Roman audience 60 years later, who would have had great respect for Tiberius Caesar. There's also a city on the Sea of Galilee called the city of Tiberias, which remains today. But Jesus' base was at Capernaum, and the feeding of the 5,000 took place just north of Capernaum. The winter was just over, and people were coming out of their houses again because it was warming up. The grass was green. So Jesus sat on the mountain with his disciples and saw this great crowd coming to him. The particular thing that was unusual that day was that towards the end of the day, Jesus said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread that these may eat?" If people come visiting you, then it is polite to offer them a meal before they leave, particularly as it's getting towards the end of the day. But Philip was quite unprepared for this proposition. How could they possibly feed such a huge crowd? It might be socially nice etiquette, but it's not feasible. We're told, though, that Jesus had a plan already. He knew what he was going to do. Philip was from that same region. He knew all the little towns nearby, and his response was, 200 denarii worth of bread is not sufficient for them, that every one of them may have a little. A denarii was a common day's wage. It would cost a lot of money to supply the bread. There's 5,000 men there, we're told. Elsewhere it's mentioned that there were women and children as well. A standard loaf of bread has about 20 slices. If you had 4 slices per person, that's 5 people eating a loaf of bread. 5,000 people would eat 1,000 loaves of bread. The calculation just staggered Philip. Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, takes a different tack. What resources do they have? Not much. There is a lad here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish. But what are they among so many? But Jesus' response was, "Make the people sit down." So they sat on the grass. Jesus took the bread, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to the disciples, and they handed it to the people. They went along in a typical Asian fashion, breaking off a piece and giving it, and some of the fish, to each of the people along the rows. And the people ate and were satisfied. They were filled. After the meal, you tidy up, and so Jesus says, gather the fragments, so that nothing is lost. And each of them came back with their small travel basket filled with fragments of the 5 barley loaves, which were left over from those who had eaten. Of course, Jesus' hospitality on this day stirred up those who were of a political mind to recognize this is truly the prophet who is to come. In other words, this is the Messiah. Moses had said in Deuteronomy 18 from verse 15, "The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from your midst, from your brethren. Him you shall hear, according to all you desired of the Lord your God in Horeb in the day of the assembly, saying, Let us not hear again the voice of the Lord my God, nor let us see this great fire any more, lest I die. And the Lord said to me, What they have spoken is good. I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their brethren, and will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak to them all that I command him. And it shall be that whoever will not hear my words, which he speaks in my name, I will require it of him. But the prophet who presumes to speak in my name, which I have not commanded to speak, or who speaks in the name of other gods, that prophet shall die." Moses had given the children of Israel bread in the wilderness, and Moses had said that the Lord would send a prophet like him. Jesus was obviously a prophet, and now he had given them bread in the wilderness, so he must be that prophet. And so that discussion was going on among the people. The feeding of the 5,000 is mentioned in all 4 Gospels as one of the really extraordinary things that Jesus did. The large majority of Jesus' miracles were done to individuals and were not known and experienced by a large number of people together. But here was a miracle that was performed before a large number of people. Of course, nobody actually saw anything happening. The bread truck didn't roll in. Jesus simply had given thanks and had fed the people without them knowing where the food had actually come from. Let us be like Andrew. When the Lord brings a need before us, bring what we have and do what we can and leave the rest up to him.